Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Maria, for this wonderful introduction. Welcome. You are, as a person, also and always a performative dictionary. I wrote down tactical manywhere immediately. This is an ongoing pleasure of our collaboration, to always be inside of new and future vocabularies. Welcome also on behalf of me at the Assemblism conference, part of the Propositions for Non-Fascist Living long-term research trajectory of BAC that was just introduced to you. My name is Jonas Staal, artist, propaganda researcher, founder of the campaign New Unions that is co-organizing this event. And before I start, I want to share a few thoughts with you on the notion of performative assembly and particularly this term, Assemblism. Oh, dat is de linkerkant, sorry. De links is rechts. Okay. Nee, dat is niet politiek theoretisch. Alleen voor Apple. So, the term Assemblism I derive from a 2015 book by Judith Butler entitled Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly. A crucial work as it deals with the notion of performative assembly as a practice to create new collectivities, to articulate new collectivities in the face of authoritarian regimes and parties taking power the world over. Something that Maria recently wrote about as a new authoritarian world order rising. We're talking here of regimes such as that of Trump in the United States, ultranationalist and fascist parties emerging throughout Europe. We can think of the regime of Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Modi in India. The problem, of course, of this list in the past years, this list has just grown and grown, is that almost naming them one after the other almost makes it the new normal. It's not the new normal. It is a situation of severe crisis and a return of real-time fascism, although in new forms than the ones that we knew from the past. What they do is that they derive power from their capacity to impose political division, and probably one of the most familiar tropes in this regard is the so-called us and them dichotomy, the us and them divide that has been cultivated through the last 16 years of the war on terror, that might not have been started by ultranationalists as such, but has certainly been exploited and cultivated throughout by them. And what Butler's work could help us with in this regard is an attempt to question, to explore how to assemble a new definition of us in relationship to this us and them dichotomy. And she does so by theorizing models of performative assembly that have emerged within worldwide popular movements and uprisings in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Popular movements and uprisings that often oppose the rise of the new authoritarian world order. We can think of the manifold movements stretching from Tunis to Egypt and Syria, known as the Arab Spring, but which includes the Rojava Revolution, which was actually Kurdish-led. We can think of the emergence of 15M, Los Indignados in Spain, Catalonia and the Basque Country, the worldwide Occupy movement, the indignant citizens movement in Greece, Gezi Park protest in Turkey, Umbrella movement in Hong Kong, Black Lives Matter, very much an international movement, Nuit debout in France, Standing Rock, as well as assemblies in the form of demonstrations by undocumented migrants and refugees, university occupations by students, collective hunger strikes in military prisons like Guantanamo Bay, and so forth. This last one, the hunger strike, I find particularly important to mention because Butler in her book also talks of the difficulty of certain forms of assembly to emerge in the public consciousness. Because we tend to associate assembly very much with the visibility of bodies on a square, but obviously there are many people that do not have access to this regime of visibility. And the hunger strike as a series of coordinated actions, although maybe in separate cells and outside of this regime of visibility, is of course also a form of performative assembly, an attempt to choreograph an idea of collectivity despite the oppression of the, in this case, military prison. So one way to represent that is, for example, through this page of a diary written by Mohamedou Ould Slahi, Mauritanian citizen that was imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay for 14 years. And here he describes, it's one of the pages in which he describes the attempts to organize collective hunger strikes in the military prison. So to return to this list of all of these popular uprisings and assemblies, in it Butler observes a geographically, politically, culturally diverse set of peoples and groups which all in one way or another assemble. And an important question is then, why do they do so? And she particularly emphasizes the importance of the notion of precarity, arguing that through this notion, precarity, we can understand how the dismantling or destruction of collective structures of life support, whether through neoliberal privatization of public institutions or even full-on warfare, how this creates the basis for people to organize themselves, to oppose a given regime. And precarity as such, Butler writes, and I quote her, brings together women, queers, transgender people, the poor, the differently abled and the stateless, but also religious and racial minorities, end of quote. Now clearly the conditions of precarity in these examples are extremely different. They radically differ. A student that demands, that protests or occupies a university to demand a reduction of debt represents an obviously different condition of precarity than a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. But although conditions of precarity differ, in all cases the term precarity, it denotes the falling away of a necessary collective infrastructure of life support. And it is in this light that Butler argues that precarity can operate, and I quote her again, as a site of alliance amongst groups of people who do not otherwise find much in common, and between whom there is sometimes even suspicion or antagonism, end of quote. Further, when the precariat gathers, even if it's an unchosen gathering, because we do not necessarily assemble out of some magical democratic spirit, we assemble because there is a threat that articulates the possibility of a collectivity to oppose this threat. When we gather, when the precariat gathers, it also gains the potential to propose alternatives to the regimes that forced it to organize, to assemble in the first place. And that is what Butler describes specifically as the performative dimension of the assembly. She writes, "A social movement is itself a social form. And when a social movement calls for a new way of life, a form of livable life, then it must at that moment enact the very principles it seeks to realize. This means that when it works, there is a performative enactment of radical democracy in such movement that alone can articulate what it might mean to lead a good life in the sense of a livable life." So then an important question is, what do these social forms that Butler speaks of, that emerge through performative assembly, what do they translate to? The Occupy movement, for example, developed self-organized free libraries, alternative media channels, a daily general assembly. So Occupy's performative assembly, its gathering of the precariat, was an attempt to collectively imagine and pre-enact the kind of democratic and socialized infrastructures its precarious constituents desired. This might not have translated into the direct realization of institutions that guarantee universal health care, free education, you name it, but in these propositions, these pre-enactments, we can see what Occupy collectively desires. It translates into this new alternative temporary institutions. A different case is that of 15M Los Indignados that preceded the Occupy movement in May 2011. And the movement provided very similar self-organized infrastructures in their camps and protests and occupations, but also translated assemblist energies into new models of political parties, such as the Citizens Platform Barcelona and Comu, which remains in power today. Yet another case is the Kurdish-led Rojava revolution in northern Syria in 2012. Inspired by the radical democratic and assembly-based theories of Abdullah Öcalan, the Rojavans revolted against the Assad regime And this resulted in the declaration of an autonomous region, in which assembly-based stateless democracy is not just an inspiration, but has actually become the day-to-day practice of countless communes, local communes, that self-organize and self-govern throughout the territory. In the context of today being the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, I think it is also important to emphasize that the Rojava Revolution is very much a women-led revolution, and I hope we will have the chance to discuss some of this in more detail in the final panel of the day with Havin Güneser. So, performative assembly can be a transformative practice, a site of radical imagination, where new democratic structures of life support, new democratic cultures are envisioned, pre-enacted, and ideally instituted into the future. The practice of performative assembly cannot and should not be understood in purely artistic terms. People don't assemble on streets or squares and put their bodies in actual danger to make art. But Butler does reference terminology that emphasizes the role that art plays within this process of performative assembly. For example, she talks about the assembly as an assemblage, almost sounding like a collage. She speaks of the theatrical dimension of assembly, and she speaks of the visual morphology of the social forms, like these temporary libraries, that it brings forward. When I use the term assemblism, I do it to refer specifically to the artistic components of performative assembly. An artistic practice, for me, can be described as assemblist when it operates in the performative assembly so in the performative assembly, or in continuation of the work of performative assembly. To put it maybe more simply, assemblist art contributes to performative assembly through artistic competences, but with the aim of achieving political change. The primal aim is not to make artworks. It is to use artistic competences to further political aims. An example, in this case, from my own artistic practice would be another organization, the New World Summit, that runs parallel to New Unions. And in 2015, it was commissioned by the democratic self-administration of Rojava, that self-governs this autonomous region in northern Syria that I referenced earlier. They invited us to collaborate with its political representatives to develop through art alternative institutions inspired by Abdullah Öcalan's philosophy of democratic confederalism, or what he explains as, and I quote, a democracy without the state. If the Rojava Revolution aimed to liberate democracy from the context of the state, from the model of the state, as a model of self-organized communal democracy, then what happens with the institutions we traditionally associate with the state, like the parliament or the embassy? And the images that you see behind me, the New World Embassy in Rojava, is one of the works that resulted from this collaboration with the democratic self-administration of Rojava. It's an example of how Rojava's assembly-based politics could translate into new transnational institutions. In this case, in the form of a stateless embassy for a stateless democracy in the Oslo City Hall, where Rojavan representatives gathered with other stateless nations, progressive political parties, and civil society platforms. Surrounded by the suns and stars that form the symbols of the Rojava Revolution, the embassy was shaped as a kind of ideological planetarium. The collective point of orientation was not the state, but the literally universal symbols under which the possibility of what Havin Güneser describes as world confederalism was collectively explored. And that also brings me to the gathering here today, which is the result of a year-long assemblist collaboration with BAC on the campaign New Unions in support of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, long title, better known as DM25, founded by economist Yanis Varoufakis, philosopher Srećko Horvat, and writer Lorenzo Marsili, who is also with us here today. The slogan of DM25 is: the EU, the European Union, will be democratized or it will disintegrate. And this slogan embodies what is at stake in this pan-European movement of the 21st century, the political, economic, and cultural democratization of the European Union. When, in 2016, curator Iliana Fokianaki introduced me to the DM founders, the DM25 founders, we began a discussion on the visual and performative dimension of the large-scale assemblies that they were organizing all across Europe in this attempt to gather different progressive political parties, civil society platforms, in this attempt to reimagine what a democratic Europe would look like and how it would operate. What is my question from an artistic perspective, what is the visual language of a trans-democratic movement that aims to unionize Europe? And with Maria, in this last year of the campaign, we added the question, how do we institute art, an assemblist art, in the popular movement, in the pan-European movement? With architect Paul Kuipers, designer Remco van Bladel, many of the DM25 activists, its cultural wing, DM Voice, we try to answer this question starting from the double wedges, this fast-forward symbol designed by composer Brian Eno as the logo, as the symbol of DM25. But we connected it to the constructivist language, another kind of wedges, of the Russian Revolution, which 100-year anniversary we celebrate this year. The red wedges of Lissitzky, as you see them here in his famous poster, became the core building elements through which to challenge and reconstruct, an attempt to reunionize, the stars of the European Union. And just as thousands of people gathered these past years in DM assemblies in Amsterdam, Athens, and Brussels, amongst others, so did the stars continue to reappear in changed constellations, seeking to capture and strengthen the democratic culture enacted through these gatherings of those seeking to assemble a new trans-democratic union. And here on stage, I am surrounded by the skeletons of the stars of this new union campaign, as well as the wooden boxes through which they have traveled with DM25 throughout Europe. BAC, this institution, has been their base. BAC also nicely translates to base, throughout 2017. This art institution became our campaign headquarters. The challenge that we were in this collaboration was thus not how to make art for the institution, but how to work with and from the institution to institute and explore the role of art in the popular movement. And as they stand here, they are also something of a statement of how we had to rethink art in the New Union's campaign, how to approach a campaign as an experimental, performative artwork. Thanks to the work of architect Paul Kuipers, that you can see here behind me, we turned these large constructions into modular ones, capable of being easily transported, assembled, deassembled, following the mad schedule of DM25, who, driven by great urgencies, is trying to build this movement. And I think this sounds very pragmatic, but I think this is actually quite important, because it means that it was not just us trying to, as artists and cultural workers, trying to contribute to the symbols and assemblist spaces of the pan-European movement. The movement also changed our understanding of art. It changed the conditions of the production of art, the circulation of art, and most of all, it changed the question for and with whom we make art. This campaign, the works that you can see in the front space when you enter the works here on stage, these are just one example, one case study. Because today we discuss performative assembly and assemblist practices in the context of many different movements and platforms, from the pan-European assembly to non-human assemblies, the question how to translate the assemblist energies from the squares and the streets into new forms of life support, new structures of life support, new forms of emancipatory governance and emancipatory self-governance. But before I hand over to the first moderator to begin the program, I want to thank everyone who made this assembly of many different assemblies possible. The team of BAC, Maria Hlavijova in specific, for all of our conversations and exchanges, and most of all of our shared actions, as well as BAC curator Matteo Lucchetti, with whom the conversation on assemblist practice has by now already spanned many different years. And I want to thank an incredible team, an incredible assembly that makes this institution operate, or that is the driving motor behind this institution becoming. Whitney, Marieke, Wietske, Bart, Hidde, Niels, Alejandro, Irene, Dennis, and all other team members that I might be forgetting. I want to thank How Theater in Berlin, that is not participating in this conference, but was also one of the supporters of the New Unions campaign. I want to thank my own team working on the New Unions campaign, the tireless Yunus Bouadi, Evelien Scheltinga, René Indemauer, Aida Koempels, designer Remco van Bladel, architect Paul Kuipers, photographer Ernie Butz, and filmmaker Ruben Hamelink. A special thanks to Aurélie Lierman, Maya Felix Brood, and Samuel Friesen, composers, musicians that developed a new collaborative assemblist musical composition that you might be experiencing throughout this day. Most of all, I want to thank the speakers and representatives that accepted our invitation and that have gathered here with us today. You, as speakers, come from many different movements and many different geographies. Many of you are implicated in day-to-day struggles that demand everything of you and of your comrades. And that is why we are grateful that you have come today to BAC, not just to discuss the rise of the new authoritarian world order, but so that we can learn from how you have assembled, what imaginaries it made possible, what sacrifices it took. And hopefully it gives us a chance to assemble with you, to imagine and build an assembly of assemblies. At least speaking on behalf of the artists and cultural workers of the New Unions campaign, we would be honored to join our imaginary with yours. Or more simply, if you need artists, that's why we're here. Tomorrow we will already start with Havin Gunesser and Birgitta Jonsdottir on a new campaign for the Freedom for Öcalan and Peace in Kurdistan platform, but I hope many other collaborations will follow. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the first assembly, Iliana Fokianaki. I mentioned her before as the curator who made the dialogue with DiEM25 possible in the first place. Fokianaki is a writer and curator, co-founder of the platform Future Climates, is conducting PhD research on the synapses between art, identity, politics, and economy at Pantheon University Athens, and since March 2017 is curator at Extra City Kunsthal Antwerp. Fokianaki is the founder of State of Concept Athens, where the New Unions campaign began in 2016, a militant and imaginative curator, writer, organizer. She will lead us through the first assembly of the day, the Pan-European Assembly. Please welcome Iliana Fokianaki.